Hi everybody, I hope you're staying safe and happy and above all, healthy. We have another free course for you today. This one is a wonderful one because it's with an artist called Mr. Pete Mroz. It features some incredible musicians. Blair Sinta on drums, Johnny Flower on bass. I'm playing guitar, but Mr. Tim Pierce is also playing guitar. And Zach Ray on keys. It's a wonderful set of musicians playing live off the floor in a room together. So there's a little tiny bit of bleed, but not much between the instruments. It's going to be a lot of fun to mix some incredible musicians in a wonderful live room. So check out the course, download the multi-tracks, stay safe, stay happy, and above all, stay healthy. Hi, it's Warren Huart here with ProMix Academy. Hope you're doing marvelously well. So today I'm going to show you a track that I recorded, engineered, produced and mixed for an artist called Pete Mroz. This was an interesting album because we did it in my old studio a few years ago. And the reason why I wanted to pick it is because it shows a little bit more like the real world. I did the whole album in just a few days. That included doing pre-production, he and I sitting down with acoustic guitars, going through, rearranging the songs. I actually co-wrote this song with him and with a girl called Robin English who sang on it as well. So this is actually a duet, a guy and a girl singing together. The band, I believe, was Blair Sinta on drums, John Button on bass. I played guitar and also, of course, did Tim Pierce. And everybody came down for a day and we recorded all the basics in a day. So it's a great example of what you can do when you don't have any time and you just have to keep it super focused and just about the song. There's no vocal tuning going on. There's all kinds of rough edges around this. It's very rough and ready. And what was interesting about it for me is it was tracked on an API. And then it was mixed a couple of evenings later, the whole album in a couple of evenings, on a Neve 8058. When I mixed it on the Neve, I had barely any EQ on the individual tracks themselves, and I was just using the Neve. So here I am, flash forward a few years later, I don't have a Neve 8058 handy. So when I opened up the session last night, I realized there was no possible way I was going to be able to just output it through the SSL and get the same sound. So today I opened it up and I tried to preserve what was special about the Neve. And to me, what was special about the original Neve mix was not a lot was done to it. I was boosting 60 on the kick. I was giving the guitar some high mids, a little low mids here and there, but I wasn't doing a huge amount to it. So what I did is I tried to take the original Neve mix idea and apply it to an SSL world. So some of these tricks and some of these EQ boosts, etc., you've seen me use before, and some of you haven't. What you're going to notice in the way I worked on this is I kept it really, really simple. And what I mean by that is on the guitars, on the piano, there is zero effects whatsoever. It's just dry and flat and up front as though it was a 70s mix. The reason for that is, I was thinking about this the other day, is that when I first started going into studios in the 80s and 90s, as a kid in the 80s and in the 90s making music, I noticed that there was a limited amount of reverbs and delays available, even in the best studios. In the best studios, there may have been a plate, there may have been a chamber, there may have been a couple of lexicons, there may have been one or two other delays or reverbs, but ultimately there was maybe 5 or 6 multi-effects at any one time. And then you would beg, borrow and steal other multi-effects from different studios, different rooms maybe in the complex. So with that in mind, I wanted to keep it really rough and ready and fat. Now, David is going to mix this song afterwards. And when he mixes it, he's going to be a lot more David-like. He's going to get in there and be more surgical with the EQ. I didn't do that because I want this to kind of be glued together and be a little wrong and not quite so separated and, in the box sounding. However, that's not a bad thing either. the great thing about this is it's going to give you two different perspectives of how to mix the song. So let's get stuck into the mix. It's pretty interesting because you'll see I'm relying on the console quite a lot, but I'm also relying on some tricks, some vocal tricks that I do and some other tricks. There's some old school ideas that I did with the drums mixed in with some newer stuff. So you're going to see some different kind of things. And what I like about this is I think it will give you an idea of what you can do, you know, using your particular ways of doing drums, etc. As ever, you're going to get the samples. There's also an artificial thwack sound that I created here. You're going to get that as too when you download, so you'll be able to use that in other recordings and other mixes. It was my naive attempt to do a transient designer because I didn't have a transient designer. So anyway, let's get stuck in. Okay, so I'm going to give you in the mix the original Neve mix and then the new SSL mix. If you're looking at this closely, you'll notice that actually the SSL is a little less, the transients on the kick and the snare are a little bit more contained, and there's a lot more energy in the track. It's a little bit more, I suppose, compressed in some ways, but also tones are a little bit fatter in some ways, and in the Neve they're fatter in others. It's an interesting thing. You're going to get to see the two different mixes a couple of years apart. Both of these mixes were inspired from working with Dave Sardi. I worked with Dave Sardi on a few albums, and he would mix on a Neve, and he wouldn't do that much to it. He would let the Neve EQ kind of come to life, but he wasn't doing a huge amount. He's the one that kind of got me into using the DBX on the kick just for the sub, and so we're going to see that. So it's kind of my attempt at doing a mix like I would do when I was working with Dave. And again, they're quite different than the SSL and the Neve mixes, but they're also quite similar in some ways. They live in the same ballpark because they're a little stuck together, glued together a little bit. They're not overly defined. Now, I think when David does the mix, I haven't heard his mix yet, it's going to be a lot more finite, you know, because he's a lot more surgical. I think he'll be more surgical and make a better pop mix than me. My mix is not a pop mix. Mine's a sort of dirty album track mix. That's kind of where I'm at, and that's what I wanted. And the whole album sounded like this. You can find it online. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so another thing that's important, and I think I have to say it out front, is we had a problem with one of the capsules on one of the mics that we didn't spot immediately, unfortunately. It probably went out as we were recording. And that was the overhead mic. If you listen to the left-hand overhead here, see that? It's not good. Now, if we go a little later in the song, it seems to have gone. Now, ultimately, you know, maybe it wasn't as bad, but it was an intermittent problem with the left-hand overhead, which was really very annoying, just to say the least. So, I'm still using the overheads. They're still in the song, and I am looking past it. Now, David may use the right-hand overhead only, and I thought about that, maybe just going mono and doing like a trashy drum sound like that, but I didn't. I basically looked at it from the point of view of like, if you listen to all the drums together here, very roomy drum tone. Tons of bass bleed. This was in a live room, a big live room, as you can tell from the ambience. This is almost entirely real room ambience. There's a little bit of verb on things, but nothing like I would usually do. This is a good sounding room. We'll go through all the mics and we'll listen to what they all did. But you can tell that problem with the overhead is kind of gone. Now we live in a world, and we talk about this all the time. I talk about this on Produce Like a Pro and in the Academy and stuff. We we live in a world where if there's a problem, people love to point it out. They like to be like, oh, that's terrible. Rah, 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 rah. Well, you know what? Things happen. Schnizzle happens. And in this situation, when we're tracking like 10 songs in a day, with others, admittedly with world-class musicians, but like setting up, getting mics, getting tones, and then just bang, going through 10 songs, this kind of stuff happens. So I also think that's a pretty nifty way of learning some stuff. Anyway, all excuses out the way. Let's go right to the top. So the first one was a kick in. Now the kick in, so a couple of things to know about it. I've time adjusted it. And again, you can drag and drop it back. I get asked this question all the time, and that's fine. If you want to pick your tracks up and move them so they're better in time, then do that. I am just going to go out on a limb here and say that I don't like the drum align programs. I think that the drum sound gets really small when everything is exactly perfect. I don't mind a little bit of, because when you walk into a room and hear a drum kit playing, you don't hear the kick, the snare, the hi-hat, the overheads all being hit. And you hear all the reflections off the room. You get a feeling of a drum kit in a room. So I'm not big on lining everything perfectly up because that is not how you hear drums. I tend to find that when I do that, or I've done that, or I've heard people do that, it tends to just sound small. Andy Wallace, who gets name checked a lot, has mixed some stuff for me over the years. He's a wonderful mixer, obviously. Very famous for mixing Nevermind by Nirvana, and also mixing Grace, and producing and engineering Grace by Jeff Buckley, which is without a doubt a masterpiece, and is the album that pretty much every band in England when I was a kid in the mid-90s playing, we wanted to be that. That's that. Jeff Buckley's voice and that recording is responsible for, you know, Radiohead and Muse and Keane and all of those bands. We all wanted to be Jeff Buckley. Still kind of do. And that album is a fantastic sounding record. And Andy said, at that point, Pro Tools was starting to become very prevalent. And he said one of the biggest problems he had when he was getting stuff to mix is everything was starting to get so perfectly in time that instead of going crang, it was kind of going crang. Everything was suddenly, there wasn't any wide ones. There wasn't any big fat hits. They were just like getting smaller because you've got all of these hits exactly in time with each other. Instead of this big fat downbeat, it's now this tiny little imperfectly in time. And there's something about humanity, about a player playing as tight as he can, as opposed to a guy like us using a computer to manipulate it. So with that in mind, this isn't on a grid, as you can see. Look how far ahead of it is. Let's go back to the grid. It is a fantastic drummer, so as you can see, he's pretty darn good to the grid. I mean, that, as human beings go, that's not bad at all. His downbeat's a little ahead, but it makes it exciting, but everything else is pretty much on there. That's what a really good drummer will do. He'll kind of push a section so it feels a little bit like anticipated and exciting, and then lay back other parts. So the kick in has got a time adjuster on it and 124 samples. Now what that's doing is it's laying back the kick in to be in time with the kick out. So if I look at it here, I go to samples, like here and here, so these two waveforms line up. 107, let's go back a little bit, 118, yeah, that says 118 there. I took an average of what I was get to read. I'll come over here, sort of around about here. 121. Yeah, I mean, I could, let's have a look at this second half of the beat here. 147. So it's a little bit between the two. So if I solo the kick in with the kick out, let's see if there's any flamming. Kick out's got a lot of weight. It's not as loud in the blend, but have a listen. I've always felt like for me that the kick out mic, and the way I was using it was I was using a Sennheiser, a big one, the 602, the big kind of kick drum mic. The kick in is a D112 inside and about halfway out. The 602 was about the same distance away from the head. So if you've got, imagine you've got the head of the kick drum here, the outside head, I doubled the distance away, so like the whole size of the kick. And it's going to be later, but it generates a very, very accurate round sound of the whole kick drum. As you can see, there's not much EQ going on the individual channel. There is on the bus, which we'll talk about in 1 second, but I feel like it's a pretty natural, accurate sound. Now, the way I did it is I tunneled. I actually had a couch with L-shaped corners, so I would lay the L shape around the mic and then baffle around it just by putting tons and tons of packing blankets on stuff. I think there's a picture of me recording Vinnie Carluto, you know, Vinnie, a couple of years, about 4 or 5 years ago, and you can see the sort of architecture in the front. I'll see if we can find it and put it in with the package so you can understand what it is. Okay, so time adjusted, kick in and kick out. It's this two together. Now these are going to my kick master. That's one on the console. And there's not a lot going on except for boost here at 60. Take it off. Back on. Little cut around about 400-ish here. And some boost at 7. Take it out, 7.5. So it's sort of more of the same. It's not changing it that drastically. Believe it or not, even with that EQ lift there, it's not changing it that drastically. What's going on the console is the sub. So I'm using the 2500 API compressor. Again, not a lot of compression, but just tapping it lightly. The console's doing the rest of the work. Now, what's interesting about this, you've probably heard me say this, and I love APIs. This was recorded on the API console. But I will say, I've never been a huge fan of their compressors as such. You know, whenever I work with, you know, Val Garay told me he did use the 525 and he did try it on vocals. There are guys that have, you know, Christopher Thorne, if you watched that video we did with Christopher Thorne, they all have API compressors, but they don't use them on day-to-day. They use them mainly for special effects or rooms and stuff. I do think, hats off to Waze, I do think their simulation of a 2500 is more useful to me than a real one. Did I just say that out loud? I just think it is. So, a little bit of compression. If I go to maybe a louder portion of the song about here, let's see if it's doing much more. Yeah, a little bit more. Not a lot if I bypass. I'm also, you know, I'm getting about maximum of a dB's worth of gain reduction, but then I'm probably giving it like plus, you know, 4. So I'm actually using it as a way to control my output. That will happen a lot. When you're manipulating your mix, you're going to find you'll get things like plug in even the EQ output, and you might want to turn the kick up, but you've written all of this crazy automation. Here I haven't, but let's just say I had written a bunch of crazy automation. I can just go and turn up the last output stage of my plugin, and it brings everything up without having to go in there and readjust everything. It's a quick and easy tip. I'm sure many of you do it. And again, you know, as the phrase goes, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat. There's no right way or wrong way. So starting from the top of the channel here on the SSL, the first thing you'll notice is that depressed is 29 and 30. That's bus 29 and 30. Bus 29 and 30 are feeding into our drum crush over here. So basically it's going to channel 29 and 30 here, and that's being crushed. So they'll come out. If you watch here, you'll see there's quite a lot of compression going on. It's on the fastest release time. So what we've got going there is the kick, the snare, and the room mics. That's it. That's all it's going to. See if we can float and have a listen. There we go. So this is the crush. I'll crank it a bit. So it's not overly, let's mute the sub as well. It's just some SSL parallel compression. It's quite a lot of top end boost. We're boosting at 10K, nut cut at the top. We're getting pretty tight on the bottom end, coming up to about 60 or 70, boosting some 300. I'll take the EQ out. And basically coming up and getting rid of some of the lows on the kick so it doesn't get too muddy. But yeah, there's a little mid-range going on as well, like a 900 boost and a little 300. It's just to add some thickness underneath. So that's our drum crush. So I'll unfloat the sub. You hear the sub come back in. Float it again. There's the sub floated. Back in. Pretty big. Float. Back in. So even though I'm sending the kick, the snare and the rooms to this drum crush here, I'm not boosting any super low lows in it because that would just really interfere with the sub and the cleanliness of the kick. You know, so it's difficult when you've got a lot of bottom end going on there. If you're going to like get them lots of competing things going on, it's really going to turn into a big phasey mess and you're not going to have the clarity. And as I've talked about in the academy, in Produce Like a Pro Academy a lot, is like what really sorts out the men from the boys and a lot of mixes is that clarity in the bottom end. I know a lot of people have made a big deal about this, but you know, about 150 or 200, definitely not above 200, personally about 150 and below is pretty mono. It should be kick, bass guitar is where I like everything to becoming central. Now with guitars, I tend to shelve up to close to about 200 hertz. So I might boost and get some body down there. I can keep that panned left and right, but everything 150 or 200 to 150 and below, it should be a mono signal. I don't want to hear it in the left and right speakers. I don't want any phase issues coming on. Cool. So we'll go back to the kick then. So as we just discussed, the kick is 2930. That's busting to the drum crush. So the channel out position here, this is really important for you to know on an SSL. When you do channel out, it goes EQ into compression. And one of the great sounds of an SSL is when the EQ smacks into the compressor. It's a really huge thing. I didn't really understand that for the longest period of time when I first started mixing on SSLs. I could never get it to sound like the way, you know, Chris or Algae, like Chris makes it sound, or, you know, any of those guys. I could never get that same sound. And that's why. It's that EQ into compression. So we have kick EQ, all the boosts that I've done going into that compressor, and it kind of gives it that spanky sound that we love. So what's going on? We've got a huge boost down here at 60, a lot of boost. We've got some cut around about 400, about quite a lot, like 4 or 5 dBs worth of cut. Then we got some boost about 2.5K, about 6 or 7 dBs worth of boost. And then we got a lot of boost, about 8. And that basically is giving us an even more exaggerated view of that kind of bottom end, that scoop low mid, and that top end and above. But just to add even more to that, I'm going to turn it up a little bit for myself, is you'll notice I've engaged the insert here. Take it off. Sounds good. Gets a little tighter. How does it get tighter? This here. I've got a bass guitar sitting in the way. Hey, it's a studio. We have gear all over the place. But look, the reason why it's got tighter is because I'm doing a little 63 boost, a little 125 cut, a little 250 cut here, and then a little 4K and a little 8K boost there, and a tiny bit of 31 cut. So I'm shaping it even more with the 560B. That's the API graphic. This is an old pair that I have. I'm actually going to get the new BAE ones, just between you and me, because these are worth like $1,000, and the BAE ones I think sound better, and they're not $1,000. They're cheaper. So I'm going to sell these and get new ones. I'm not that much of a snob that I need that. So inserted EQ, it's tightening up. It's cool. I like that. Put this in. It's a little tighter. There's something about API stuff, 312s, 560s, 550s, you know, any of the EQs and stuff, that EQs or mic pre's, there's something about those 2520 op amps that everybody likes. I'm not an electronics engineer, many of you watching this may be. They just seem to soak up the transients so you can hit it really, really hard, and they just seem to just, you know, make things sound a little sweeter. I really love them. So basically the only other thing that's important to know, and it is important, is that out of auxiliary 4 here, I'm sending to our 120A, our DBX 120A, and that's amazing. That's giving us that sub harmonic, and the sub is down here. The way that I've got it set is it's not super low. It's probably giving me about 40 because it's between 36 and 56, and I'm slightly over that, so I'm probably getting like a little extra 40 boost and a little bit of like 30, so I'm getting like a 30-40 boost. So let's put in our sub. Pretty huge. Sub out. Now put it in. Wow. That's making a massive difference. So there's my kick. Okay, so now samples are coming out 25-26 on the console, and there's two. They're both time adjusted so that they're in phase with the kick out, which is the latest sounding kick, the one we hear last. Here's the PR kick. This is a very aggressive kick. And that aggressive kick is feeding the kick room. And the kick room is just a good old generic deverb. Nothing particularly, you know, exciting. Dry. So there's some mute automation in it. Get rid of that. So as you can see, three quarters of a second's worth of reverb on it. Those of you who watch my videos will know that's kind of a magic number for me because it's kind of similar to the live room sound. And guess which live room we're talking about? We're talking about this live room. For instance, here's my close rooms mics. You see it's pretty similar. Obviously EQ wise, the way that my close room worked, I'll describe in a minute, was very different, but pretty similar. If I go to my far rooms, they're a long way away. So for me, it's pretty similar to what I have. So if I'm going to add some ambience in there, obviously I'm using a lot brighter ambience and I'm using a darker room tone, and I'll explain how I did that in a minute. I stick with something. I don't suddenly put a 2-second reverb on something when my room is not big enough to support a 2-second reverb. I could do, if this was a big metal track and I wanted a huge, it was a halftime ballad and I wanted, hey, why not? But it's not. Okay, so that's my kick. So we've got those two samples. They're just time adjusted. Otherwise, they're coming out of the console with the console EQ setting. Next up, snare top. Now, the live snare is time adjusted to the overhead, so it's 121 samples back. That's bringing it back to the overheads. I'll explain that to you. So we pull up the overheads here. If you see it here, let's just find a moment and pull that back. There we go. 125 there. You know, 121. It probably measures different in different areas. So anyway, it's laying it back, the snare back with our overheads, 121 samples. And here is our snare sound. So what's going on to create that snare sound? Obviously quite a lot of different stuff. Well, firstly, time adjuster is bringing it back to the overheads. Secondly, is a lot of top end boost. kind of dark. Even though that's just the top head, you're still hearing a bit of the bottom head come out. Let's move these overheads out of the way, so not in the way. And that is going out of 2, snare, master 2 to the console. There's another gentle lift here. It's up a couple of dB, about 7K, so even more top end boost. And then gentle roll off, just getting rid of the low lows of the kick. Not a particularly aggressive high pass, but just a little bit. Turn it off. Back on. So what I mainly hear is the difference of the snare. Top end. Back on. It's just an extra over the top, which is fantastic. Okay, so that's our snare top. Now, what is driving and what is next up? And this is like an old trick that I used to do, which is kind of cool. So I've got 5 and 6 here, and 5 and 6 is sending to this bus here. Also, my snare sample here is on 5 and 6, and also my snare, another snare sample on 5 and 6. So I'll show you everything I've got. Those that you haven't already, go to Produce Like a Pro, sign up for the email list, and you're going to get to download all of those drum samples. The D28 is one of my favorite snares. It's sloppy, it's messy. I'm using it here to send to a combination of the snare top, the D28, and what's our other snare we're sending? Oh, the more aggressive snare sample, the thwack, which we'll look at in a second. Those are all going there. So the D28, the EQ on that is TimeAdjuster again, just to roll it back into the, after I laid it in manually, because what we will do is we'll take these 4 snare samples and group them and lay them against the snare top. So they'll be perfectly in phase with that, and then you just run TimeAdjuster to knock them back. Or you can pick them all up and drag them back. Personally, I use TimeAdjuster. It's really up to you. Okay, so with the snare, got the TimeAdjuster, then just a tiny bit of shaping, just adding a little bit more attack here. Not a huge amount, just a tiny bit. Next up is some EQ. Now it's pulling out this kind of doing-y noise, just to build up in 350. The great thing about using surgical EQ like this is you can pull it out where there's a build-up and it doesn't bother anybody. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever because it's so small and finite, it doesn't really change the whole nature of the sound. Because look how narrow the band is. So you get a nasty frequency, and that's a combination frequency of lots of instruments building up. Next up here, we have a snare sample. So that snare sample that ambience is on the snare sample already. Okay, and our 2 friends here underneath the live snare. This one's a fun one. These are the ones I made. So what these are snare thwacks. I made them using compression set. This is before I had a Transient Designer, because this Transient Designer is a recent acquisition. So before I had a Transient Designer, I had to fake it. So, and you're going to have these to play with and use and do whatever you like with, or you can just use the Transient Designer. But what I did is I had the attack set so the initial attack would come through and then the compression would grab it really aggressively. So we get this. Yeah. You might think I'm crazy, but imagine you don't have a Transient Designer, you're trying to add that back in. I made a snare thwack sound and then blended it back in. You might call me crazy, but that's what I did. So I had that to just say the snare top. Take it out. Listen to the snare without it. back in. It's just adding that pa, pa. See, that was my humble way of doing it. But also what I did is when I made that, that's off a live snare, I also did it with a room mic from my studio. So I got this. And now that I have a Transient Designer, I shaped it a little bit more. I also put an L1 across it just to get rid of the initial attack a bit more, as without it. Sounds good, but... And then on the very end, some low and high boost, 100 and 5K, just to give it some body, two together. Throw in the snare top. D28, just huge on the reverb, snare sample, and last but not least we have the snare bottom. So this is a trick I do all the time. So I've got my snare bottom, it's got a time adjuster pushing it back in time with the overheads. I've got a compressor on the snare bottom. Obviously snare top and snare bottom, and one of the samples are all being fed to our snare EQ here, our snare bus. But you can hear that there's some kick bleed. So what I've done is I've gone from a sample on my kick here, I've got it pre-fade so it's not affecting whether I'm in solo or not, and I'm sending to a compressor on the snare bottom mic. Take it off. Listen to the kick. Now it's compressing out the snare bottom. And it's got the fastest release time. So what I might try and do, just because I can, and because we're here now, is do the same thing on the snare top. Let's see what happens. It's kind of nice. So it's compressing the kick sidechain to the compressor. Does that make sense? So I've got my snare bottom here. I've got an R comp on it. It's coming out of bus 9 from the kick. So it's kind of a nice trick. And so it's just doing the extra compression of the snares when the kick is playing. So it's a much nicer way of removing it without gating it. I'm hitting the console pretty hard. I know when I'm mixing with Chris, with CLA, there's a lot of red lights going on it, so I'm not too afraid. I do think if they're stuck down for too long on red, it tends to get a little soft sounding. But again, the same thing, 29, 30, going to the drum crush over there. EQing pretty heavily. EQ out, kind of boxy. EQ in, I'm boosting some 5K. I'm boosting sort of like 5 and 6K twice. I am boosting a little 250, and I'm boosting a little 100. So I'm basically boosting like 250, 100, hit like 100 to 250 here, and then like some 5K lift. I'm really going for it on that. A little boxy without the EQ in. Put the EQ in. Now I'm also got an insert. First of all, the level drops considerably when I take the insert out. Well, what's inserted? Well, this is kind of magical and expensive, but it's a big part of the sound. Here we have a Pultec. This is one of the new ones built by Steve Jackson. It's pretty amazing. Got some 100 boost. And I got some 8K boost. So, out, in. It's nice. There's something, we didn't do a specific shootout we should do, but we did we compared subtly a Pultec, a real Pultec like this, to a plug-in version of it, and I won't mention which Signature Series one it is. It's not even close. I haven't, and I don't have the UA Pultecs. I hear they are amazing. So once I get those, we'll compare them against real ones. But a great Pultec is just super special. Middly, nice though. Bit more body. It's great. Okay, so that's for our snare. That's the EQP-1A3. All right, next up we have the thwack room. Now, what this is it's a gate. So the gate is helping us send a nice clean signal of just the snare. Some compression. And the way that the default setting, and we talked about this before in other videos, but the way the default setting is coming on off the Renaissance compressor is it allows just enough attack and the release holds for just the right amount of time that it adds a little bit of extra aggression to my verb. Then I've got an MV2 just to add some body on it. You know, I love the MV2, just pulling out some 650 where it's really nasally. Listen to that on the reverb. Without the EQ, with the EQ, nice and poof, exaggerates that. And I'm using a true verb. And I boosted the top end on the true verb like crazy. It's a second decay, so not that much, but listen. With. So that's a big part of our sound on this time. It's a big part of the sound before I add in the rooms, which are really going to help. So the reverb is coming out on 3536, which is a stereo pair on the console with no EQ and no compression on them. So I've already done all the EQ compression on here. There's additional EQ obviously going on with the other channels going to the console, but this one there isn't. We don't have anything coming out 3536 except for the D28 reverb. That's that reverb thwack. So that's that reverb that we're sending a little bit from the snare top, a little bit from one of the samples, and a bit from the D28. Sometimes that will have other samples in it, but at the moment it just has that verb. So our samples are the two different kicks there and the snare top. The snare top sample, sorry. So we've got the snare samples and also the thwack, remember, is coming through the channels on the console. But the generic kick and snare samples are coming up on here. I've got around about a 60 boost. I've got a bit of a 350 cut. I've got a little boost at like 2K, a tiny amount. Probably catching a little bit more of the click on the kick, and then a little tiny bit at about 6K, and then I'm cutting some low lows up to 20, and I'm coming up to 12 on the 12 on the very top. So I'm just sort of controlling it a little bit like this. You know, I don't need any real super openness at like 12K unless it's, you know, something, you know, that really needs to breathe up there. Try and leave that world for a vocal, you know. Okay, so next up is toms. And the toms were, they weren't necessarily the best. So the tom's interesting. I've got untreated toms here. Here's just a live tom. Barely doing anything. He hardly played it, really super light. But I'm blending it with a gained up tom track here. So this is gained up. So we're sending verb from here. In isolation, it's quite a lot. Let's bring it down a little bit. floor here. So the floor, that's the live floor untreated. No additional EQ on that floor mic, just verb. On the actual tom bus here, this is where we got a little crazier. We've got the 350 pulled out, some highs, and then an R bass. Take that off. The R bass just giving it some real body. And what I like to do, and you've seen me talk about this before if you've watched any of my other videos, is I like to shape what's going into an R bass. Because if I send in a lot of super lows, like 20 and all that kind of stuff, and 40 and 60 even on a tom track, and then I'll bass it afterwards and use the boost, it will just be completely out of control. Then I have to get carried away. So I shape what's going in. So here's the EQ before. So it's rolling off at 72. It's not that steep, but it's steepish going into an R bass. Gives a good body. So what we have, to recap, what we have is the original live tom track here, the original live floor tom track here, and then we have a boosted up version of the same track, and this is just to give me ambience. Now, what I do now is I volume automate these, or I gain them down. I gain down between and gain up, but I don't go as crazy. What this was is like I have a track that was just the ambience, and then the track was just the boost. It's not the best way of doing it, but it's the way I was doing it then. And when we opened up the session, that's what we had. So my tom master we've done, the tom reverb, and this is coming out 3 and 4. The tom reverb is going to 35, 36, and you might ask why that is. Well, because the EQ that's being applied to the tom channels, I don't want to apply to the verb. I want the verb to just be the way I want to hear it. So if we listen to these two together, there's a little compression going in. Gives me a more even verb. Pretty big verb. Top end taken off a little bit. So I guess it's a pretty natural sound. So 35, 36 on the console, 3 and 4 on the toms. Now the toms aren't going to, they're just going straight to the mix bus. There's a rack, and there's a floor. And they're both together. Okay, so our EQ points on this are some boost around about 100. I've got the toms individually set and panned slightly in, so they're not super wide. We got some cut at around about 300, where I think it's pretty ugly. I've got some boost on the top end at about 4K and at about 6K. I'm also coming up to about 60 on both of them, and high passing about 60, and also high passing around about 12, so there's not too much top end in there. So I've got both of those are high passing about 12. So that's our toms. Actually just adjust it like that. Next up is the overheads, and as you heard before, there is a problem with the left-hand mic. Bad when I take this out. Now these are pretty dark mics. Now I am trying for the life of me, trying to remember what I used. They're not 414s. It's there. That distortion's still on the left-hand mic, even there. But I'm dealing with it. Now, the reason why I got so drastic in pulling out all this 350 pretty aggressively is it kills your toms. That area of that boor really ruins your tom. So if I've got this tom trick playing here, tom track, I take this out, it gets all horrible. So you're going to notice I pulled a lot of 350 out. Now next up, coming out of 5 and 6 on the console, is the hi-hat here. And I actually used a little bit of time adjuster just to pull it back in time with the, here with the overheads. So I've got some time adjuster, and then a little REQ just pulling out. Let's go to the second verse. I'll put a little extra boost. This was done on the API, and it's a combination of a 57 and an Audio-Technica 4041. So they're taped together and then blended. You see me do that a lot. So it's not pretty, that distortion there, but throw it into the kit, it's good. It works. Now, David may take one of the mics and use it in mono. Cool, so the tambo's folded back in on 5 and 6 into the overheads, which is also where the hi-hat's coming out. So we can just listen to that. Got my old friend analog channel. There's like a mistake where it goes in early. It's amazing when you're making a record in no time whatsoever. Things just fly through. Okay, next up is a little L1 just to catch those peaks. It's really helping. It gives a little bit more life to the tail end of it as well. So that's coming out the overhead channel. So on our overheads, there's a decent amount of compression, just like a 3 dB on some of those hits there. I am high passing up to 120. Take the EQ out. Little boxy. Remember the hat's coming down here as well. So nothing going on the bottom end. We've already cut to 120. High passing at 120. There's some cut at about 350. You know me, 350 on drums can be a little ugly, so I'm cutting the 350 out. I'm boosting at 5 and I'm boosting at 10. So I'm doing about 3 dB at 5 and 3 dB at 10. So effectively I've kind of got this, some low mid cut, and then some gentle slope up. And that gives us, you know, a beautiful, sweet top end that an SSL can do. This is where we get fun. Now, I will put a cymbal down quite often in front of the drum kit. So a cymbal on the ground and then mic the cymbal. And that's what this is. It's great. That distortion on that microphone. So all together. So that's just that one room mic. I'm going to take it out. Back in. I love that mic. It's so good. You can do a whole drum sound with that. If I take this EQ off. I mean, you can hear that bass guitar bleed. The whole band's in the live room playing together. Shelley Yakos's live, you know, this is his favorite thing. Shelley will talk about this all the time. So that's everybody playing in the same room at the same time. Cool. Next up are my close rooms. Now my close rooms are actually miking the wall, but the wall and the lower quarter, it's like this high up, is all carpeted, so it's dark. Still hear that bass bleed. Then the far rooms, there's no EQ or anything done to this yet, you'll see in a second. The far rooms are miking the sides of the walls with just a pair of 57s. It's great. Okay, so overall, we've got all of those bussed together. Last but no means least is a salt shaker mic, which I got from Dave Jordan. No EQ. See, I pulled that 350 out. Look what it does to the toms. It kills them. Here's the... out. Back in. It's like cool. Horrible. So I'm putting that 350 out so it doesn't affect the tom sound. That's a salt shaker. That's an Altec mic. It's like a cheap, really, really cheap mic. And it's great. It works really, really super well. It's trashy. You can get a great drum sound out of it. I mean, these two together, no EQ. If you want to do a mix with just those couple of mics. See, what I've done over the years, you know, people talk about the Glyn Johns or the Andy Johns technique and all these different ways, is like I've learned to go into a room and mic up all the possibilities. And because I'm so used to doing it, if I wanted to do a lo-fi mix, my mix is pretty lo-fi, it's all glued together and loud and spongy and all that kind of stuff. But if I wanted to go super, super lo-fi, I could just pull out a couple of those mics. And I've got a completely different drum sound. Look, here's all of the rooms together, for instance. That's a good drum sound. And that's going through an old favorite of mine that I have had for about 1 million years, the MasterX3. This is TC Electronics' old mastering tool. I set it to a smiley face. Have a listen. Without it on. Smiley face. It's barely doing anything. It's barely compressing, barely limiting. It's just like an EQ. It's great. Really, really tasty plugin that should not be abused. You'll really hear it. And then an L1 just to give us consistent level. Barely doing anything. Take it off. It's just pulling up the level. Going into the console. Now our room mics, this was a good room, so we got lots of great drum mics on this. EQ wise, a little bit of 60 boost. We've already shaped it coming in, so this is a little extra 60. I'll take it out. You hear the vocal in there, you can hear the bleed of the bass, you can hear everything. It's fantastic. That's what you get when you get a band in a room. Okay, another 350 cut, but tiny, about 1.5 to 2 dBs of cut. No top end boost. To speak of, maybe the tiniest amount at about 9. And then I'm cutting at about 60, 70. Basically, Dave Jordan taught me when you want to get a nice sharp, on an SSL, you want to get a nice sharp EQ point, you boost and cut at the same frequency. So that's where I got from him. So what he's doing is he's boosting at like 60, 70 to bring out the kick, and then he's bringing the high pass up to the same point, and you'll get this nice, sharp 60 hertz, but nothing below kind of boost. So there you go, there is our drum sound. Let's just let's make sure everything's in solo. Put everything on. Okay, here's the drum sound. It's great. Very simple. Keeps the integrity of the song. It's a little sophisticated, but not that sophisticated. So the only other thing that's left, we talked about the crushed drums, is our parallel here, which our overheads are actually coming, they're being bussed on 23 and 24, and they're going to this here. So it says bus 23, 24, and it's a stereo DBX. And that stereo DBX is just giving us a little extra energy from the overheads. So the overheads are being a little bit squashed hard, and then they're returning here where it says DBX parallel. You can push them. See there? But I'm actually going to bring them up a little bit from where I had them. You hear this? So I'm actually going to bring them up slightly anyway, so I think it'll add some energy to the mix. Cool. So that's everything on our drums. It's a cool drum sound. Happy with that. Next up, bass. Now this is John Button. John's an amazing bass player. He plays with Roger Daltrey from The Who, he plays with Shakira, he plays with Sheryl Crow, plays with loads of people. He's an amazing bass player. All right, so it's kind of trashy. Here's my DI. What I did is I took out the super lows and above the mid-range, here's the unaffected sound. It's pretty good, but I wanted a trashier tone. The MV2, my old friend, is compressing the top and the bottom and giving us a nice. So now it's an ugly kind of middly tone, but put it with this, which is even uglier, the Sans amp. With an REQ, taking off all the lows, put the two together. Pretty ugly, but you don't listen to music like that. We listen to it combined. So next up is a mic. This is actually an 87 on the flip top. So again, all together. Here is our winner. Now this is the speaker trick. So this is a speaker, a 15-inch speaker. It's actually a monitor speaker, like in those big, huge monitor cabs, pushed up against his flip top. And then, so it's a mic, it's a speaker miking another speaker. It's pretty remarkable. And the way it works is all of the bottom end is left and all the top end is removed, and we get put everything else in. So we've got all that. The reason why I'm rolling all of those super lows, like 110, like all of that's being removed from the other mics, is because one of the biggest issues with phase is not so much the high frequencies, because you get so much detail on high frequencies. You know, they're like tiny little frequencies. Having them sit on top of each other and cancel out is quite difficult. Because if the frequencies are so tiny, can you imagine trying to line up a million of those at the same time? But cancelling out low frequencies is so easy, so unbelievably easy. So if I've got this big fat waveform here, look at that huge fat waveform. Now I'm using TimeAdjuster to bring those back in time. So yeah, so the DI and everything is coming back to it. But the biggest problem I'm having is that the lows are always going to fight each other. Cool. So now we have these all dragged back so they're in the same waveform. However, those low frequencies have been EQ'd out of the other mics. But here is what we get. The low end on this is just fantastic. So, what do we have going on our Bassmaster? Well, our Bassmaster, we have 250 and below on a multiband, a C4 multiband, heavily compressing it. That's the 250 and below. See how much? It's doing that much gain reduction. So it's like 4 dBs worth of gain reduction. And what it's doing is it's keeping everything at 250 and below nice and evenly compressed. It's really handy. Then after that is an REQ2, which is just giving us some boost on some high mids here and then gently rolling off at like 53, so it keeps it out of the way of the kick. Then I've got some 800 boost, which gives me that kind of dong, and I love the way the API sounds, so I'm using that. And as we talked about before, I've done the shaping before, so now I'm adding the RBass. Just adding the extra. Little extra lows. MV2, an amazing plugin for. Just keeps it really up front the whole time. More 800 on another API. And another 764. So it's all, if I get rid of those, it's a nice bass tone. But this is giving me all the no's, so it's pointing out.
Epitaphs, all those goodbye notes, the songs you wrote back when we were...
Cool. So lots of tricks there on the bass. That's coming out of the console, and you can see what I've done is almost nothing on the console. There's only a couple of minor things. Now, what's different about this bass compared with some of the others that we've talked about before is I'm not doing anything on the channel. I'm hitting the channel a little hard, I'll be honest, but I'm not compressing and I'm not EQing. Now you might say, why is that? Well, first of all, I'm doing obviously a lot of stuff in the box, so you'd think, well, that's probably enough, and it should be. But when I made the last Aerosmith record, we did, I probably talked about this before, those who've been watching before, but we did a lot of it on tape, transferred in real time using Clasp, so we had the benefit of hitting it really hard on the tape. But when I was doing rough mixes, we had this API matrix of line amps that we got from them. And when I came to mix the album for real, and I mixed half of it up here at my studio on this console, when I came to mix that, the problem I was having is like I could get everything to sound better except the bass. And it was something about the way that those APIs and those transients were soaked up by that 2520, by that op amp. And I find that when I engage the EQ, the bottom end, the roundness disappears for me. And when I engage I found that really the best way for me to mix bass was to get the sound exactly the way I wanted in the box, and bypass the EQ and compression on the console, or get an API line amp and have that somehow or another come back in on insert. And I haven't ruled that out. The only thing is, I've got one little trick up my sleeve. Here's the bass. So what's that trick? Where did all that beautiful body come from? Well, that beautiful body came from a new toy. And this new toy is the new Pultec EQP-1A3. It's the API one, so it has another one of those 2520s in it, so it's got what I want. And I'm boosting some 100, which is great. I'm narrowing the bandwidth a little bit, and it's really giving me and a little top end. It looks like a little 3K. So a little 3K and a little 100 on it. And I am loving it. It just kind of gives me, it gives me a lot of personality. If I turn it off. Sounds good. Put it in. I mean, obviously it's giving us more level, but it's also boosting those frequencies that I really want to hear more of. It's a great little toy. I'm really glad Steve Jackson designed it. I don't know how much they are. I think they're relatively expensive, but I've been tracking a lot recently using it, and what I've been doing is we just sort of move it around on different pieces of equipment. There's a lot of discussion in my academy, in the forums. There's been a couple of people talking about, they've seen some YouTube videos of some guys that are looking at waveforms and saying, don't use this EQ or don't use this plugin because it changed the phase. And people are like saying, but I can't hear it change. And they're like, doesn't matter, look. Well, it does matter. I mean, the thing is, active EQ will always change the phase relationship. That's the beauty of passive EQs and why people always liked Pultecs. However, there's tons of active EQ here, and many people have made incredible records on SSLs, some of the biggest selling records of all time, and nobody ever worried about it until they could start to look at it. So as much as I love Pultecs, whether you've got a console, whether you're completely in the box, remember, it doesn't matter what the waveform looks like when you print it. What does it sound like? And you know, it's really important to think that way. It's like, is it sounding better? Just use your ears, don't look, I suppose is what I'm saying. So here's bass and drums together. The bass is really screwed up. It's like really farty and crappy. I love it. Okay, acoustic guitar. All of the EQ, all of the compression is on 11 and 12 on the console. The recording of it was pretty straightforward. It says Pete Acoustic, but it's actually Warren Acoustic. It's Pete's Acoustic, but it's me playing it. Sorry, Pete. I don't remember what it was. And I do know that it was my old Magic mic, which is broken, which was a little Gaffel. 582. No, a 691 Gaffel. Great mic. It got broken, unfortunately. It has to get repaired. Great mic. Wish I could remember what guitar it was. It was a smaller body acoustic. I like the smaller body ones. The small Gibsons, the small Martins are very easy to record and they just sound fantastic. So all the EQ, all compression, 11 and 12 on the console. No reverb, no delays on this version of the mix. So the acoustic, nothing inside of the box, as you know, just getting rid of some of that ugliness on the lows. So I am actually cutting at about 250. I'm boosting at 7. And I'm boosting at about 9. But I'm also coming up to about 100 and just high passing. And I'm also low passing at about 10K. So I'm boosting a lot of top, but then I'm controlling it here. And I've got no real lows to speak of. So if I take it off, nosy, ugly, EQ back in, great. No additional compression. All right, next up is a hard panned guitar. Tim Pierce. Heavy EQ. If you guys watch the Produce Like a Pro video series, you'll know I do some drastic EQ, but I always use EQs that I like the sound of to do that. And I'm doing it here with a Mac DSP. It's just nose, it gets in the way. Little L1, not even being used, just in the chain, probably just got left on. But then our old favorite, I love this plugin. And you know why I like it? Because there's 3 compressors in one and it's 27 whopping dollars. God bless America. Well, God bless Germany in this respect. So there's a little bit of drive, tiny bit, a little bit of compression, not much. Without it on, with it on, take it off. You know, one of my favorite hardware compressors, I mean there's a million, but one of my favorite hardware compressors was always a Manley Verimu. And the reason why I like the sound of a Verimu, if you watch the Aspen Pittman stuff, he talks about like the circuitry involved in like Verimus and stuff like that. The reason why I like them is they always seem to just tame the top end for me. So if I was mixing on a large format console and I was in a studio, I had some Verimus, like a pair of them, or at least one stereo pair, I would always bust my guitars through it. And it was like having an extra EQ. It was like I could boost the top end on the console and then have the Verimu just kind of tuck it back in. And that's what this does. It just kind of allows me to, I got it on the dark. It just, I don't know, it just makes it feel fatter, controls the top end. It's like an EQ, distortion, compression, everything all in one. Great plugin. So that's coming out 13, panned hard left, doesn't change throughout the song, no volume automation. This is a band in a room playing. It says guitar live, why? Because it's the live guitar playing. That's the performance. So here's our first overdub, and there's only 2 overdubs on the whole song. So here's our first overdub. Tim again. So he's printing it with effects. There's no EQ, no compression on it here. It's only on the console. You hear what he did? You hear him turn off his pedal and then get the turn the reverb on. Yeah? Dry. All right, so players like this, look, that's a take with some overdubs at the end. Players like this are worth their weight in gold. That is a performance. Here's some fixes at the end, but that is a performance. And he is doing all the work for us. And people often ask me, and I think this is a great conversation to have, people often ask me about printing effects on for pedals. If you're dealing with real artists like this, like a player like Tim Pierce, he's got a delay going on here, then he goes to a reverb in the pre-chorus, and then he changes the sound for the chorus. He drives it up at the end for that. It's like there's already 4 different guitar sounds going on, and they're printed. And why am I going to mess with that? That is the creativity that happened with an artist such as Tim Pierce. So nothing on that except for the console. 13 and 14 on the console. Electric Rhythms. Here we are. We'll solo this one for the time being. No EQ on the console, just letting it happen the way it's recorded. This one on the left-hand side is very heavily EQ'd in the box. And the one on the right, which is going to come in about 3, 2, 1. Just left it really full. But they're both being compressed, just tucking it in. So not a lot going on. So if you were to simulate what I'm doing, you could just open an SSL channel strip if you have it, or you could just use a light amount of compression and tuck it in. All right, next up we have the guitar solo, which is a really dirty, dark guitar solo. It's played on slide, and here it is. This slide guitar part is amazing. It's Tim. We just punched a different outro, but you can see it's just a take with a different outro. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. It's very reminiscent of Pink Floyd to me. It's definitely got that all about the melody kind of feel, very Dave Gilmour. I know that Tim's a fan. Well, isn't everybody? Gentle top end boost here. Whacked a deverb on it. Take it with off. He's obviously printed it with delays, but I just wanted to sink it into the track a little bit with some verb. And then I've got an MV2, my old favourite. Just keeping it even. So that's going out 15, 16 on the console. This has got a little bit more work to it. So I'm boosting some like 253 to give it some real body. I'm also cutting around about, about 900. Little mid-range that I don't want. Cuttings from 2K, but I'm boosting like 5. So without EQ, little nosy with the EQ. Just get rid of some of the nose and a bit of top end boost. I'm also coming up to about 100 cut, and I'm also I'm also cutting at about 8K on the top. So between 100 and 8K, I'm sort of controlling it. I could get more drastic, but that's great for me. So as I was talking about, when I did this song originally, it was done on a Neve, and there wasn't as much choice as I have on this. There wasn't compression on every channel. There wasn't EQ, well, there was EQ on every channel, but I wasn't necessarily EQing everything. So even though I know David is going to take this over the edge with his incredible EQing that he does, and I know that he's like really into like some of the most cutting edge plugins and stuff, and I think that's fantastic. But this, and I am too, but this is not about this. This for me was realizing that same vision that the Neve one have, but just doing it, and I worked pretty quickly on the console here, but just kind of reproducing that feel, but within an SSL world. So it still has enough warmth and still sounds like the same glued together country-ish rock folky song that it is supposed to be, which means not using compression on every channel. As you see, there's a lot of things where the compression's not engaged. That'd be the bass, the acoustics, the rhythms have got some compression, but only 2 to 3 dB maximum and no EQ. The lead is the only thing that's got a lot more compression and EQ. Next up really is the piano. Next up, last instrument that we're going to be talking about is the upright. Now the upright is really just it's actually my piano when it used to be in the old studio, believe it or not. Just all that bleed. I don't remember who played it. It may have been me. It may have been Pete. I'd have to ask him. But very simple piano part. It's that piano, the same Hamilton Baldwin piano. It's just, it used to be in the old studio. It's one mic. I believe it's a 414. It's either a 414 or it's my old beaten up U87, which has probably got nothing left. And that is going out onto the console out of the piano output 21, 22, and all of the tricks of the trade are on the console there. Nothing in the box. So the piano. This has actually got quite a lot of work done to it by my accounts. There's an insert here, which is another pair of Pultecs. These are the API ones. These are the EQP-1A3s. You can see there's a lot of emphasis on those 2520s. There's a lot of equipment we have here that has those particular API op amps in it. There's something about them, they're pretty magical. Here's the EQ out. What I'm doing is I'm boosting 100 for some lows, and I'm boosting some 5K for some aggression. So I'm treating it a little bit like an electric guitar. I'm EQing it in a way, kind of like a little bit of girth there, and a little bit of aggression on the 5K. Because there's not a lot of instrumentation in this, so I'm trying to make it a bit more aggressive. Nothing boost lows here, that's all being taken care of there. There's some cut at about 100, so I'm getting a nice tight 100 cut. No insert, insert in. There is nothing going on the low mids. All that's happening now is some boost at about 4.5, 5K, and a bit of boost at about 8K. And then I'm high passing. I'm high passing up to 8. So there's my piano. So that's everything except for vocals so far. So there's the instrumental track. All right, next up, and not last, and definitely no means least, we have the vocal. Now, Pete's lead vocal is very interesting. If you look on the console, I have panned Pete slightly to the right by about 10%. And I panned Robin slightly to the left. And you're not really going to feel like they're panned left or right, but when they sing together, let's put them both together, you're going to hear just a little bit of additional separation because of the panning.
Slept alone with your photographs and your epitaphs, all those goodbye notes, the songs you wrote.
Now, there was a tiny amount of tuning going on this, and when I say tune and consolidated, we're talking like little notes here and there. There's a lot of stuff you can hear which is just letting it go. But we moved really quick, really fast on this stuff. There wasn't a huge amount of takes on any of this stuff. Look, there's Robin. We've got 5 takes comped together. 5 takes, which is like not a small amount. And there's 6 takes. There's 6 takes for Pete. So, you know, in the wonderful world of digital, that's not much at all. And they did a wonderful job. I just have to say that. Okay, so Pete is an RVox, and you see me do it all the time. Let's go in here and have a listen.
Slept alone with your photographs and your...
So -7-ish, the same for Robin here.
Slept alone with your photographs and your epitaphs, all those...
A little bit more compression, a little bit more just to smooth her out a little bit against him together.
Slept alone with your
You see how you can't really tune that because, you know, with your... She's just kind of going off and doing something really kind of natural. The only other thing with Pete here, like I said, is a 7.5, 8K kind of lift, just brightening him up a little bit. There's a little bit of low build up on her voice. He's a guy, you know. It was an 87, not a 47, so it's a U87, and it had just a little bit of a low, you know, low shelf. You'll go to the console and you'll hear that I cut some of that out of his voice, believe it or not. Okay, so now he has got his own vocal sub here, and the vocal sub starts off with the trim.
Slept alone with your...
Going into a vocal rider. The vocal rider is really just pushing up.
Slept alone with your...
So what the vocal rider is doing is it's, because we're moving quickly and we were mixing a whole album really super quick, and because now coming back to it, you know, moving quickly, frankly, the vocal rider is doing that volume automation. I love, you know, instead of me going in there and automating every syllable or clip gaining it or all the other ways that you can do it, the vocal rider is doing it for me. So watch it.
Slept alone with your photographs and your epitaphs, all those goodbye notes.
Let's go to like a softer section here. Watch this.
Back when I can see your face.
See what it's doing? It's doing a great job of just taking these lower phrases and pushing them up. So it's automating, running beautiful volume stuff. It's really tasty. Okay, next up, tiny amount of EQ here at 7K basically. You know I love the sound of the Mac DSP. It's just really beautiful. A little bit of de-essing.
Back when we were...
Let's go to here and have a listen.
With your photographs and your...
So de-essing's doing a little bit of work. Another little lift here, a bit more aggressive, 3 dB, and then some low roll-off at about 197. Followed by a little bit of RComp.
With your photographs and your epitaphs, all those good...
Now you'll notice, I talk about this a lot in other videos, but the default setting on the the Renaissance comp, the RCompressor, is really tasty because it allows just enough attack to make it exciting through.
With your photographs.
Just a little bit. I like the way it defaults. I think they did a very smart job. Again, a little bit more top end lift. You're going to notice that when I'm mixing and I'm working, I do gentle amounts of stuff, and I won't go back to a plugin and just turn it up drastically. I might just keep adding different plugins. You know, I've got 2 different manufacturers worth of EQ going on, and then another de-esser, because what I'm doing is I'm adding top end, which is making everything feel a little brighter and edgier. But then, of course, the S's and the T's will maybe get a little too exaggerated. So here's my
On with your photographs and
another de-esser doing it. Last but no means least is a tiny, tiny amount of overdrive on a lo-fi.
on with your photographs and your
I just hear it slightly, and I hear a little coming in there, take it off.
on with your photographs and your
Put it back on.
on with your photographs and your
Just a little bit of extra drive. It's tasty. So that is my vocal sound for both of them. I used identical buses. I just gave them different outputs. So on the console, it goes to 24 for Pete and 23 for Robin. Now just the lead vocal.
never-ending dreams.
I went a lot brighter than I did on the original version. The only thing I really did that I feel was dramatically different from the Neve version of this one is just make it a little bit more brighter and just a little bit more, you know, the Neve, the 8058, is close. It's not quite as wide sounding as this SSL. I don't know why this SSL is particularly wider, but it is the widest sounding console I've ever worked on. It just seems to spill out of the edges. I'm very blessed to have that sound. I mean, just to be able to compare a Neve 8058, one of the best consoles in the world, and then, which I know the guitars were panned hard left and hard right, just to be able to compare that to the way the SSL seems to throw it even wider is pretty miraculous. Anyway, so we've got some cut at 300 because he just had that lows. That low mids I wanted to get rid of. There's a little cut at 2.5, and then there's some boost around about 6.5, and some boost about 10. And I'm coming up to about 100 high passing, and I'm doing the trick of the EQ into the compressor, so it's got that kind of SSL effect. Now, I mirrored the EQ in almost entirely exactly on her vocal as well, so on Robin's vocal. So the other thing, as I was talking about earlier, she's panned ever so slightly left, he's panned ever so slightly right, so we get this. They pretty much feel like they're in the center, but they're like this. I mixed a duet with Emmylou Harris and Isaac Slade from The Fray. They did Boulder to Birmingham, or Birmingham, as they say over in America. It was beautiful. It's her signature song, and of course Isaac's an incredible singer. So I did the duet, and I mixed that on the Neve, and that's what I did. I ever so slightly panned. So it's interesting. I should come back here and work on another duet, and think the same way on the SSL. I mean, I missed that Neve, but it was such a one sound that was phenomenal. But I do like the flexibility of the SSL and doing increasingly more mixing in the box. I also feel like it's great for that. There's just something about this width. The width of this is absolutely ridiculous. Okay, so that is the EQ on that, the slight panning. Okay, so what else is going on with that? Well, so these three effects here, the distortion, the octave, and the whisper are all coming out of 20 on the console. So a solo 20 on the console, and have a listen.
Slept alone with your photographs and your epitaphs, all those goodbye notes, the songs you wrote.
Well, that's cranked. Here it is in the mix.
Alone with your photographs and your
See the amount of distortion going on? It's awesome.
all those goodbye notes.
Saturation also from the SPL.
Slept alone with your
It's really tasty.
photographs and your
Take them out.
epitaphs, all those goodbye notes, the songs you wrote. Slept alone with your photographs and your epitaphs, all those goodbye notes.
So these are all things I'm just doing to Pete's voice, just to give him a unique and different sound to Robin. It's just really subtle, but I love it. Next up is the octave on Pete's voice.
Slept alone with your photograph.
Yeah, that's for real. That's the octave. So we've got a pitch change here. You see I've got it one, it's AVA, I've got it one octave down. Bypass it. So it's minus 12 semitones, one octave down. It's quiet. There's a gate. So that if there's any like bleed from other instruments, that's not going through and getting a low octave on it. I'm gating it just to the vocal. After that is an REQ, getting rid of any kind of top end bleed there might be. So that's also coming off. Okay, last but no means least is my favorite trick, which is the whisper track. Using the Morph Oda, which I think is a genius. All three together.
Your photographs and your epitaphs, all those goodbye notes, the songs you wrote. Slept alone with your photographs and your epitaphs.
Great, so those, I'm only using them on Pete because Pete's the main lead singer, and frankly I just needed the vocals to sound slightly different. You know, and so I'm treating them in different ways. The H3000 trick here is interesting. That's the vocal thickening trick that I do. That's the -3 + 3, -6 + 6, -9 + 9, and they're panned opposite each other, so it goes up and down, up and down. It's great. It just gives us it's like a chorusing effect, but it's more controllable because I can run it, boost it and cut it, which I did in different sections.
Photographs.
Now, last but no means least, I'm printed effects through a lexicon. And these effects here are through the PCM 90. I was looking down at it to remember which model it was, because I had over the years I've had a PCM 70, a PCM 80, and a PCM 90. This is a PCM 90. One of them, the top one. And they're obviously both singers. They're just great effects. An echo plate. Just really, really cool stuff. And all of this stuff is automated, all these effects. So, for instance, if you look down here, everything's grouped together, all the multi-effects. I could show you, if I just go to volume automation, see here? They're all grouped, so it's quieter here, goes up on the pre-chorus, and then stays loud through the rest of the song. And all these effects here, I've got R-verb, which is set quite long. I've got a short tiled reverb, and then an echo boy. And the echo boy is set to a 16th, and a second echo boy is set to a quarter. Now, the reason why I use these two with a compressor after them is from bus 10, I'm feeding the vocal back into it. So let's go to the lead vocal subs here, and you'll see what I mean. Here's our lead vocal sub, and you'll see I've got all the different effects being fed from here. 3 and 4 is going to the reverb, and then I've got these dynamic delays. So these are feeding the dynamic delays here. So you see dynamic delay, which we just looked at. The echo boys are dynamic delays. And how are they dynamic delays? Well, bus 10 here is feeding the vocal back into a compressor. So,
in sweet harmony.
hear what happened there? See the compression. Do it again. You'll hear the. I'll do it again. You'll hear sweet harmony, compression.
In sweet harmony.
Soon as the vocal finishes singing, the compressor stops working and the delays come up. Now, there are dynamic delays that do that. You can buy delays that have a dynamic function and you just sidechain it back into itself and it does it. But I'm a traditionalist. I mean, that's how we used to always do dynamic delays. Tim Palmer loves dynamic delays. He uses them all the time. He's a big exponent of them and they sound great. So what I've got there is a dynamic delay that's coming in after the vocal finishes. So it compresses the delays. They're still there, but they're very quiet. As soon as the vocal finishes, the compressor releases, the delays come up in volume. And there's two of them.
In sweet harmony.
It's great, especially that quarter note one, which comes in afterwards. So that is my multi-effects. Two of those, two delays, and two reverbs. Plus the printed lexicon and the H3000, which is the vocal thickness trick. All the multi-effects from the Pro Tools are coming back on here. And we have this.
Never-ending dreams. Back when
So there's two delays and two reverbs, plus the lexicon reverbs. And they're all blended, and we get that. Cool. So the last thing to talk about, mix bus. So this is the loudest part in the song, so it's the most smashed. We're coming up to about 3 and occasional 4 dB reduction. So pretty heavy, but to take it out for a second, it might blow up our So it's interesting, the mix between the SSL and the Neve gets a little closer sounding when you don't use the bus compression. When I mix on the Neve, I didn't own one at the time, but there was a company called Design Effects I used to rent from. This is about 4 years ago, and I used to rent the Focusrite Red, and I'd use that on my mix bus. So I didn't have the SSL, but I had the Focusrite Red. So my threshold is set maximum, so I'm barely hitting it, but I'm still getting that gain reduction. And then I'm making up the gain there. We're set to auto release and we're set to full right attack, 4:1 ratio. So for every, it takes, it's basically the medium kind of setting. For every 4 dB that goes over 0, 1 goes through. So it's the medium setting. 10 isn't really the limit, but I go to 10. Let's see what it's doing to the snare. 2, 4, 10. 10, the snare starts to go, which is okay if that's what you want. Okay, that's the basic mix bus compression there, and then the last secret is our friends over here. Again, more dollars thrown at the subject, and these are a pair of Pultec EQs. When I was mixing on the Neve, sometimes I would rent a GML. Most of the time I wouldn't. Sometimes I would rent an EQ for the mix bus, but most of the time I would just rent the Focusrite. Occasionally I would get the GML. It depends if sometimes that GML I wanted was out, so I didn't get to have it. I will say that these are spectacular, and they're mastering grade ones. See, they're the EQP-1A3s, and they're mastering, which means they're totally recallable because they're all clickable. So 60 boost and 12K boost, which is pretty mastering, you know, boom and fizz, just some high-end air, and I think that makes a huge difference to the mix. Here's without them. In, out, listen to the kick, Now, okay.
Back when we
Pretty spectacular. I mean, when I give my mastering guys that, they've got something to grab onto because they've got the little extra 60 that's coming and that's some air over the top. So it's a really good combination of factors, you know, it really, really helps. So there's a combo platter. Very simple mix by my standards. Didn't use any delays, didn't use any reverbs on the guitars. Dry. One pair of electrics, didn't have any EQ on at all, just had some compression. The guitar slide solo had EQ and compression, but very simple mix. Down below here we have the new print, and above it the original Neve print from several years ago. So you're going to get to kind of hear where it's gone. I've still kept this pretty, you know, trashy, fat sounding. It's not hi-fi. I know that David will take it to a whole new place and make it probably a lot more hot AC friendly than I did. But my whole thing was this sort of like done in a day, recording, overdubs, mixing in a couple of evenings sort of feel of an album. We did spend a bit of time, a couple of days, Pete and I, going through all of the parts and everything, but essentially it was done very, very fast, but very creatively. And I'm really proud of the results considering. I hope you have a wonderful time mixing this and really get stuck into this. I think it could be really fantastic. Sorry about the overhead problem on the left, but you know, that's life. I spoke to David about this. I called him and I said, hey, you know, there was a problem with this overhead. And he's like, heck, who cares? He's like, that's good because that will give everybody a chance to see what it's really like. And this is really what it's really like. You know, this is, I think, well recorded with exceptions, with that exception. I think it's important to understand that for most of us, even on a higher level, if you're getting mixes from well-recorded stuff, there's still mistakes. I remember working on a single that I'm not going to say who it is. I want to. Of a big band in the early 2000s, huge band, and working on the song, and it was a massive producer with a famous engineer, and there were so many things that were kind of wrong with it. I couldn't believe how compressed things were and how difficult it would be to mix because they had tied it in such a situation that it was just the sound, but it was a sound that didn't really seem to work very well. And they had overcompressed the overheads and the hi-hat so that everything was bleeding into the hi-hat. You know, every time you heard ch-ch-ch, you heard ch-ch, it was like snare and hi-hat equally as loud in them. So if you try to turn up the hi-hat, you were also getting the snare. So that's where you have to do sidechain compression to try and pull the snare out and do all kinds of tricks. But the problem is when a drummer's playing, the hat and the snare are playing together. So what do? You sidechain the snare out of it so the hat goes chit-chit, chit-chit, and compresses the extra hi-hat every single time. It was just a kind of a disaster. And it was a big record, and the song I was working on went to become a huge hit. So I think to myself, it's really important. You know, if you've watched any of my stuff, produced like a pro stuff or anything like that, I really want to break down sort of an elite idea that, you know, everybody's a genius and everybody else isn't, because it's not like that. In the real world, honestly, some of the best recordings ever made, are all based on the performances and the performances alone, whether it be the Beatles or the Stones or Zeppelin. It's all about these incredible performances, these wonderful songs, and often, not all the time, but often it's about great production and great tones. And Jeff Emmerich doing that trick with the speaker mic and the speaker, I stole that from Dave Jerden. Dave Jerden stole that from Jeff Emmerich, because Jeff Emmerich does it on Taxman. It's an 18-inch cab miking another 18-inch cab. So it's important with these things to remember that in the real world, nothing is perfect, and things that are happy accidents are wonderful, and things that are mistakes can lead into something really, really great.